Hello and welcome to this latest Cartspun Publishing presentation. It's the story of the Watt Institute, the author George Blake, and the Greenock War Memorial. Pictured here is the Greenock War Memorial. Many of you may recognise this magnificent tribute to the glorious dead. This memorial has a fascinating story, and it's a story made all the more interesting because it is the subject of a book, Returned Empty, by the renowned Scottish and Greenock-born author George Blake, most famous for his novel The Shipbuilders and being a director of Faber and Faber. This story is about class, loss, and the commemoration in a small Scottish town. Actually, wait a minute. This is the Greenock War Memorial. But if the committee of the Watt Institute and Maclean Museum had had their way, the first image would indeed have been the Greenock War Memorial. But let me first set the scene. Greenock in the 19th century. A place that made the fortunes of many, based on the trade of the Clyde. Shipowners made their money through sugar, tobacco and general trade with the world, and shipbuilders made their money by providing for these shipowners. These images show perfectly what Greenock was about in the 18th and 19th centuries. It's trade, tobacco, sugar, rum, etc. In my book, Clyde Eldorado, I say it's about fish and ships, but I won't repeat my usual joke about fish and chips. Oops. The population expanded rapidly, and the rich built their Shangri-La in the west end of the town. Large houses, tree-lined streets. Their children were educated at Greenock Academy, and in their spare time they played cricket and rugby. And of course, the numerous churches to serve their religious needs. Victorian values ruled their lives, taking an active part in the running of the town and of course tried to influence the morals of the society by advancing their beliefs. Church missions, benevolent societies, temperance societies, etc. They of course needed the usual means of spending their money and bettering themselves, thus the Greenock Library, Philosophical Society, art clubs, the Maclean Museum and the local volunteers. Greenock had the first unit of rifle volunteers in Scotland. Local historian R.M. Smith wrote in 1922, Greenock could not escape the fate of being, for the most part, the home of a well-to-do minority and a labouring mass. The inhabitants of Greenock are not difficult of classification. They comprise three distinct grades: the masses, the tradesmen and shopkeepers, and the shipbuilders, engineers, sugar refiners, and a limited group of manufacturers. 50 years ago or less, ship owners formed no inconsiderable part of the well-to-do. Now, so far as Greenock knows them, they are but a small body. The literati of the place have clustered about the James Watt Club, and in more recent years connected themselves with the Philosophical Society and the Greenock Library. Greenock has long been a nursery for the higher offices and vocations in the great cities. We have come to regard with unwandering eyes the constant exodus of youth to the more populous centres. It is remarkable how many members of old Greenock families have gone out and gained fame or fortune. The Cairds, the Watts, the sugar refining McPhees, the Ferries and Lyles, the shipowning Curries and Allens, the McIvors, the Lairds, and many others of like reputation. And so we can see how the elite of Greenock saw themselves and went about cultivating a sophistication of class that was visible to all. They extended this to the civic scene by building one of the most outrageous town halls of the time, with a tower designed to compete with Glasgow and definitely be bigger than Paisley's. They developed the harbours and ended up bankrupting the town by building the James Watt dock. But they had a vision. Greenock had seen the influx of Irish and Highlanders who sought work in this rapidly industrialising port: shipbuilding, engineering, sugar refining, dockwork, etc. Greenock had pretensions of grandeur, but certainly this didn't extend to the idea of providing suitable housing for the working classes. Greenock slums were ranked among the worst in Scotland. So this was Greenock in 1918, a place split in two. By this time the cultural institutions of the town were united under the title of the Watt Institute, but its roots lay in several places. The Watt Memorial. An anniversary dinner presided over by the Chief Magistrate was held in January 1821, and this was the first public demonstration in the country in acknowledgement of Watt's genius and life work. With an occasional brief break in continuity, the anniversary was observed by this club until 1862, when it was taken under the wing of the Philosophical Society and carried on in the form of an annual Watt lecture to this day. A monumental memorial was started by the club, and in 1826 it was resolved to raise a marble statue by Chantry, for the reception of which Watt's eldest son, Mr. James Watt of Aston Hall, offered to erect a building. The statue was delivered in 1838. The foundation stone was laid in 1835 on a site in Union Street gifted by Sir Michael Shaw Stewart. The inscription on the plate bearing these words: "To receive and preserve for the contemplation of succeeding generations a marble statue dedicated by the inhabitants of Greenock to the memory of their illustrious townsman James Watt, and to afford accommodation for a scientific library founded by him in 1816 and for the public library of Greenock." The building was opened in 1837 and the statue deposited in 1838. The Museum and Hall. In 1876, through the munificence of Mr. James Maclean, sawmiller, a building similar in architectural design, intended to provide a museum and lecture hall, was erected on the Watt Monument ground. After enlarging the Watt Institution and Monument, Mr. Maclean, on his death in 1877, left the free residue of his estate, heritable and movable, to his trustees, to be used for the instruction and improvement of the inhabitants of my native town, and the further furnishing of the said building, and providing lectures on scientific, philosophical, literary, and other improving subjects, and providing a stock of suitable objects for the museum and works of permanent value for the library, and aiding in the maintenance and support of the said institution in other respects in a state of efficiency. The Maclean Museum was built in matching grey sandstone in 1876 to the designs of Alexander Adamson in a sympathetic, if more Victorian style. While in its detailing, it takes its cue directly from the library, especially its fenestration and corner pinnacles. Its plan makes a sculptural composition of the whole complex in a truly Victorian manner. The gable end of the museum balances the west end of the library, with subsidiary building elements arranged in between, and the entrance porch placed hard against the protruding gable of the museum, perhaps intentionally emphasizing its relation to the latter building. As I've said already, the museum and hall were the bequest of Greenock timber merchant James Maclean, and the interiors show an emphasis on the use of timber, including the plain vertical boarding used throughout the museum and hall. Built in Greenock's heyday, the museum enjoys a Victorian display of structure and innovation, especially in the span and slender trusses, perhaps originally too slender, of the roof and the large plate glass roof lights which originally lit both the museum and the hall. The Greenock Library. Its inception dates back to January 1st, 1783. The movement for reading facilities on an adequate scale for the more cultured, which was being experienced in all the chief centres of population throughout Scotland, had in Greenock an earlier function than in neighbouring towns. Stirling's Library, Glasgow, followed the Greenock lead 8 years later. Paisley came next in 1802, and Glasgow Public Library was initiated in 1804. Greenock Library was situated in a variety of places in the town, until eventually in 1837 it became associated with the Watt Monument in Union Street. The Watt Scientific Library was founded in 1816 through a donation of £100 from James Watt, who desired to form the beginning of a scientific library for the instruction of the youth of Greenock. From that time, other illustrious sons of Greenock donated collections of books on a variety of subjects, some very rare indeed. The Institute was the cultural centre of the town. The Philosophical Society. This society was formed on October the 24th, 1861, the membership of the James Watt Club merging itself into the new institution. The Society has for its chief objects the promotion of literature, science and art by the reading and discussion of original essays and papers and the engagement of eminent public lecturers. As already stated, Mr. James Maclean in 1875 made the Society a gift of £6,400, which was the total sum required for the erection of a lecture hall and museum on the ground behind the Watt Monument. The internal management of the hall and museum is vested in a committee comprising an equal number of members of the Philosophical Society and of the Greenock Library. And then war came. The greatest disaster to hit the town was the events of the 12th of July 1915 at Gallipoli, when the local territorial unit, the 5th Argylls, were pretty much annihilated. This is where George Blake comes in. George Blake was a product of the West End. His father owned a sugar engineering company. He was educated at the Greenock Academy, attended Glasgow University, and was a member of the Royal West Boat Club. He was set up to be a lawyer. He was also in the Glasgow University Officers Training Corps and was an officer in the 5th Argylls Territorial Battalion. He saw it as his social duty to contribute to society, and the Territorials was one way of doing this. His story is that he went to Gallipoli in 1915, having never fired a gun in anger. He and the rest of the Greenock Battalion charged up Achibaba on the 12th of July and got virtually annihilated. They lost all but 2 officers. He was shot in the knee and returned home utterly sickened by his experience. Advised by his friend Neil Munro, he took up writing. His wartime writing is truly an exercise in bitterness and cynicism. The Path of Glory tells the story of the 5th Argylls and rails against the waste of life and the destruction of the youth of a town. All bar 2 of his Greenock Academy classmates were killed in the war. The following passages give a tone of his thoughts. George Blake describes the journey of the Argylls from Pink Farm in Gallipoli to the firing line on the 9th of July. The snake-like line came to a fold in the ground, which was marked by a double signboard. Oxford Street said one blade, Regent Street the other. They followed the battalion up Regent Street. This was the communication trench at last, and now the slow pain of the journey began in earnest. they struggled on. The slope was now considerable, and Regent Street was narrow. It was possible to look back and see the Aegean shining in the distance, but few sought that relief. The thing was to go on, with eyes shut against the sun glare. The bombardment came with the effect of a clap of thunder out of a blue sky. There was nothing to be done but listen to that overwhelming torrent of sound, to the incessant thud of the pieces behind, to the bedlam scream of the shells overhead, to the crashes of their bursting in the Turkish line 100 yards away. Men ceased to talk, gave up every attempt at conversational ease. This thunder implied so much. A man had to sit and think. It was coming at last, that culminating test of which they had talked and boasted and dreamed. And now that it was upon them, men paused for the first time to realize its grim and final implications. It was coming, inexorable. So this was his description of what it was actually like. Scottish author Compton Mackenzie in his book It was bright daylight when a breezy corporal turned them out for breakfast and told them that the sister brigade had attacked on the right at dawn. Of that attack no reliable news was to be got, and those raw troops swallowed every mad yarn that rumour sent buzzing along the line. They believed for 1 hour that their comrades had broken through, that the Turks were cracking and fleeing, that Achi Baba was about to fall. Then the story was that the attack had failed, that 3 battalions of the division had been shattered, that the trenches over the way were cluttered with the dead and dying. There was not among them the intelligence to deduce from the tempest of rifle fire on the right that the usual had happened, that many men had died to take a stretch of Turkish trench, and that it was being desperately held by weary men against desperate counter-attacks. They could not reason that the captured trench was tactically useless, and that, when this day was over, things would be much as they were before. They needed sensation, and if the cold facts of war did not provide it, then they invented it. Later in the day they saw some of the side issues of battle. The front line cried for water, and 2 platoons of A Company trudged down Regent Street to Romano's Well. In the nullah there they saw the steady trickle of blood from the battlefield, the endless procession of stretchers moving down. Stretcher after stretcher, some with gay warriors who smiled and waved to them, some with men who groaned in pain, some whose burdens were silent and impassive as death itself. And at the Eske line they caught a glimpse of a dressing station like a shambles, where doctors worked with blood-stained forearms and men with punctured stomachs babbled hideous hilarity under the influence of morphia. And so to 1918. In March 1918, the government made it known that it would be an idea for museums to consider collecting war material. The secretary of the museum started collecting World War I posters. The committee then proposed the idea of a museum extension, combined with a memorial to the glorious dead. The council agreed and supported the plan. It was all going well until the local newspaper ran an opinion column asking in whose name this was being done. In response to the idea of the Watt Institution being given a new extension as a war memorial, a series of articles appeared in the Greenock Herald. I'll repeat them all here now. This is quite a long section, but I think it's worth listening to the prose and the absolute bitterness and tearing apart of those in charge, and the idea of making the West End institution a war memorial for the masses. It came to pass in the latter days that the war ceased and the warring lines were at peace. But the people did not love one another, for there was war in their hearts. Israel had put to flight the Philistines, and the Philistines were raised against themselves. But Israel was not content. Israel was at war with Israel. The men of money were glad, but the men of labour bethought unto themselves that they were sore pressed. In the great war many had been slain, many men of might had been slain, and the people were sore of heart. Many had died, and the people were vexed. In those days there was trouble, and the trouble was grievous to bear. And it came to pass, the people gave thought to the sufferings of the sorrowing. And it was said that the people would build a memorial unto those brave men who perished in the war. And it was so. And certain elders of the city held council and agreed amongst themselves to tell people what to do. Verily, verily, I say unto you, said the elders, that this must needs be a great memorial of mighty worth, a memorial that speak for the fame of those who have fallen against the foe, and a memorial of those great and mighty men who have built unto the fallen this great memorial. And the people spake unto the elders, saying in this wise, and of what form or shape will this memorial take? And the elders spake haughtily, saying, the people must bow to the elders. The elders know what people must have, but the people know not what they want. The elders further said, what we shall do will be a memorial until all generations, both for the heroes of the war and for ourselves, for all time and forevermore. The people shall build unto us a memorial wherein to house our treasures. Our treasures are pictures, and the treasure house will be called a gallery of art. O woe unto ye, scribes and Pharisees, if you build not unto us this great memorial. And the people vowed a vow unto themselves that they would please the elders and build a house for the great. And the treasure house would serve as a memorial to the mighty men or war and to the elders. This is quite dripping with sarcasm. And the people gathered themselves together and resolved unto themselves to build a memorial. And they brake off their earrings and their bracelets of gold, and they brought forth of their treasure to pay for the memorial. And the elders saw that the people gave with a glad heart, and waxed proud, and said, Lo, unto us a great thing is befallen, for the memorial shall be unto us and unto the mighty men of war. And the people wrote not of this thing. And so the kin of Bashan and all other kin gave to this memorial, and speedily it became to pass that a great sum of money was gathered together in one place. And the memorial prospered and found favour. And the elders waxed haughty with a mighty haughtiness. And it came to pass that the memorial was built. The memorial to the mighty men of war was built, and all the people rejoiced. But after a time it seemed unto the people as if the elders had eaten them up, and the people were wroth. They conceived in their minds that the memorial was not a good thing, and that the people had been blinded with a great light of much talk. In the meantime, a poor woman, a widow whose husband had been killed in the war, drew right unto the memorial. Now this was the treasure house of the elders. Where the treasure is, there is the heart. And the elders guarded their treasure with a great care, and set one in charge thereof. And this one was clothed in fine apparel, and had much gold about his raiment. In the later days he would have been numbered with the brass bound. But the man was the janitor or caretaker of the elders. And so the man saw the widow woman of the soldier coming up into the treasure house of the elders, and she had with her a little child. And the janitor said unto the poor woman, who was meanly clad, What want ye here? Know ye not that this is the treasure house of the elders? Only those who are clothed in purple and fine linen may enter therein. And the poor woman was humbled, and her child wept grievously. And she thought herself of how her husband had laid down his life for his country, and yet she could not enter the house built unto his memory, to his memory and the other heroes who had been killed by the enemy. Now the woman was angry when she thought on these things, and she replied unto the janitor. And the janitor was a haughty one, and held himself as if the treasure house was his alone. And the woman told the janitor that the people would wax wroth when they heard of this thing, and tear down the treasure house of the elders. And she said that it was not a memorial to the fallen, but a memorial to the elders. A memorial to the fallen would have been to have built houses for the people to live in, or mayhap bathhouses for the people to wash in. And the woman was indignant in her just anger. And the woman said unto the janitor, The elders have done me much harm. May the Lord reward them according to their works. Now the people heard of this thing, and a mighty breath bestirred them, and they came clamorously against the treasure house of the elders, even against the great pictures which they had stored there. And the treasures of the elder were as dung beneath the feet of the people. And verily the treasures were of little worth, and the people were very wroth, and left not one stone standing upon another of the elders' treasure house. And the people were pleased at what they had done, and rejoiced. The Greenock Herald. In Blake's book, the central character, David Esselmont, came back to his hometown, the Glen, having served in the war and heard about the plan for the gallery extension from his uncle, a man who had profited from the war selling butter and cheese, who also had a son who had avoided conscription. He met the editor of the local newspaper in a pub, who then encouraged him to write an article. Esselmont rails against everything: architecture, religion, profiteering, parochialism, commemoration, borough government, the inability of those at home to understand what it actually was like on the Western Front. And one can't help but think this is an entirely autobiographical. Can't find any proof, but I would like to think it was indeed George Blake himself who wrote the article in the Greenock Herald, and who's behind the campaign to get it thrown out. Here are a few passages from the book which show the disparity he found on his return. "Well, Davy," he began sententiously, "from what the papers were saying this morning, we've got them on the run." A swift, unreasonable flood of anger blackened my mind. We've got them on the run? And who the hell are we? Cheese merchants and pork butchers and profiteers winning the bloody war at 50% profit. Queer things happened in my mind. Pictures flashed through it. A battalion rising out of the trench to attack and the machine guns busy amongst them. Swathes of dead boys face downwards on the ground. A shell landing in a crowded bay and one man's entrails thrown across the contorted face of another with his testicles torn off. A stump of leg sticking out of a rotten boot in the mud by Bossing. Shreds of my corporal's flesh hanging from a shattered tree in Mamet's Wood. All this and more in a second or two, I answered through clenched teeth. "It looks like it," I said. The preacher reached an end, but I experienced no sense of relief. His voice ceased, but it had granted his oration more validity than it really possessed, and I felt lonely and hurt. It was as if I had come back to live among aliens, people whom I did not understand. For 4 years the army had been my world. For me the army was the nation. What the army thought or felt was the authentic thought or feeling of decent people. It could not be that the sentiment of those who had stayed at home had any worth compared with the sentiment of the soldiers who carried their convictions to the point of death. And here in Glen they were talking and acting as if it was the other way about, as if the army was a posse or policeman on picturesque but distant and relatively unimportant outpost duty. From George Blake's The Shipbuilders, talking about a reunion of soldiers. The high tea of Scotland is at any time a meal of strange diversity. Fish or meat, or even bacon and eggs, form the core of it, but the celebrant is made free at the same time of toast and bread and scones and jams and cakes, all in remarkable profusion, and it matters little in what order he chooses to indulge himself. Any little difficulties of gurgitation that may arise are eased by the swallowing of cup after cup of strong brown stuff out of a large pot. Leslie found himself prominent at the top table and down on the list for a speech, and he felt it was all rather empty and pretentious. Rich men feigning to be delighted with a high tea of bacon and eggs and pastries unlimited. Poor men deluding themselves that it was at once an honour and their right to have the officers sitting down with them to a real good feed at not less than 3 bob a skull. To the mind detached, the speeches also rang a little false. The king, the regiment, the battalion, our fallen comrades. Endless minutes of luxuriant claptrap, not in all that lay the reality. But when the table was cleared and the drinks began to circulate and songs were sung and stories told, it seemed that all these men sloughed the skin of formality and emerged honest and lovable. It was lovely, the comradeship revealed in the singing of old familiar choruses and in worn but ever-glowing domestic reminiscences of training in Fifeshire, of Egypt and Gallipoli, Sinai and Palestine, France and the occupation. It was an escape to honesty through confession of the common humanity. For the brief hour they were men naked to each other, hopeful, sentimental, scabrous, noisy and crude, escaping from every bond of Presbyterian reticence or social awareness. They rioted in primitive emotions. This fair town of ours, a damned lie to begin with. Just one of those dirty huddles of mean, grey, graceless buildings with which the Scots, making money in the early decades of the industrial age, and blind to all else but money, befouled the lovely face of their land. They sinned against the light when they built the Glen and its like, and the sin is dogging their seed still, and will dog it for many a day to come. Bonnie Scotland, see Glen and die. I reflected bitterly, hurting myself with fantastic phrases. As I said earlier, Glen is the name that George Blake gave to Greenock in his books. We were nearing the church, and an anticipatory hush fell upon us. For myself, I wanted to laugh. If ever I see the broom law, Road UF church again, I shall want to laugh. It is not that the fabric, imitation late Gothic and red sandstone, is not quite tolerable. What caught my eye was the narrow fan of ivy growing up the gable of the north transept, and at once I was reminded of Archie Taggart, now under a white stone in the military cemetery at Étaples. Archie and I had been at school together, and we ran across each other often in France, and the standing joke between us was the bi-monthly bulletin sent out by the minister of this very church to communicants not on active service. The Reverend J. Dowie Gregg wielded a mellifluous pen. Not a message of his, but referred sweetly but inaccurately to the little ivy-covered church at home. "How's the little ivy-covered church at home?" became my first greeting to Archie when our ways crossed. "Fine, aye," he would cry, grinning. "Pop into my dugout and have a snifter, and I'll read you the Dowie's latest. Beat St. John to a frazzle." We got a great deal of salutary fun out of these epistles to the troops, these pitiful, sententious messages from another planet that knew not war. "Ah well," Archie would say, folding the paper carefully and putting it away, "they always come in handy for bumf." Above all things, the Broomlaw Road UF church was genteel. It always seemed to me to have very much the air of a suburban drawing room. Religion as a passion, one felt, was out of place within its walls. Here one worshipped according to the rules of correct behaviour, as conceived by the more prosperous sort of shopkeeper. Two suave managers in frock coats presided over the late at the door, and they bowed decorously as you placed your penny, your sixpence, or your half-crown in the wooden bowl. There was a black enamelled peg for your hat and coat in the vestibule. The organist would be counted on to be working his way through Raff's Cavatina or Lamar and G as you made your way down one of the two rather narrow aisles. To look round at the people behind would have been an unthinkable solecism, but you noted for subsequent discussion the figures of attendance in the pews before you, and you were very careful not to exchange so much as a smile even with your dearest friend across the way. The whole place, in short, symbolised the triumph of polite Presbyterianism, the decline of a faith, the ascendancy of a convention. The managers could not go back altogether on the aboriginal austerities of the sect. They could not reach out too glad a hand to the libertinage of Episcopalian fashion, so they'd compromise, and the result was in the term of approbation most frequently used among them: nice. I believe George Blake was talking about St. Paul's, or Finnart St. Paul's, or the circus school as it is now. And then we saw what had been done to commemorate those who would never see Glen again. Another old soldier of the wooden platoon with which Mr. Struan Stronach had garrisoned half the communities of Lowland Scotland. This one rested piously on his arms reversed. The sight of it had no effect on me that I can remember. It was all as per schedule. My eyes strayed, however, to the rows of names on the panel facing me. With a nice sense of social differences even in death, they had been cut in order of rank. But I had known men in every group, and to me they were all one in their pitiful fate. They were just dead. No more than that, and I began to think that they were well out of it, after all, fortunate at the last in their inscrutable aloofness. All this bleating of parsons and waw-wawing of generals could not touch them, had indeed nothing to do with them. This ceremonial was entirely the affair of the living, who had put up a memorial to their own sentimentality and observed the rites of a cult. The dead were beyond all that, secure in the vast mystery of their state, dead and damned lucky to be dead. I did not hear the last prayer, but the bugles proclaiming the last post to the howling wind caught me by the throat. Before that clamant challenge my defences went down. I remembered nights in camp and old jests and tents, and all the rough, rich comradeship of men who were dead, men I would never see again, men betrayed. That was too much for me, and I turned and hurried across the wet grass, my head down to the rain. and now it all seems little more than a baddish dream. It was only another war memorial unveiled, another addition to the long and endless tale of human stupidity. The world, one comes to realise, this civilised world of ours, if you please, is pimpled all over with war memorials. Wherever a man goes, there he stumbles upon a monument of some sort to men dead in some war. Every capital city in the world is no more than a species of cemetery. London, what is it but a dumping ground for grandiose tributes in stone and bronze to the soldiers of Waterloo, of the Crimea, of South Africa, of a score of forgotten imperial campaigns? In all the churches of England there hang against the walls the tattered flags carried in battle by men that are dust, and the walls of them are studded with tablets to the memory of soldiers unimportant in life and less important dead. Paris, Berlin, Vienna, Rome, Madrid, the story is the same in each, this old, false story of the pride and vainglory of the moment. America has not escaped the universe of folly, and I think now of the little cemeteries of Maryland, of St. Gaudens's Negroes marching down Beacon Street in Boston, of tiny tawdry flags waving over mounds in New Hampshire graveyards, of acre upon acre of serried stones on the slopes of Arlington, and of that fantastic marble arena in which the at last United States believed themselves to be expressing a nation's final triumph over the spirit of war. And now I know that the memorials of all the wars of the past are but a handful beside the pillars and crosses and cenotaphs and howitzers and stone that litter Europe and America in memory of the millions who died in the second decade of this century. For what? Laid down their lives for liberty in the war to end war. If it were only true, but it is not true. One goes on through the dreary catalogue, the uplifted coffin in Whitehall, tongues of ghostly flame lashing upon a brazier under the Arc de Triomphe, the penny bazaar of mixed antiquities that we Scots have set up in Edinburgh Castle and call a shrine, tawdry painted plaster casts in villages of Normandy, and a German mine on Boston Common, soldiers charging with bayonets fixed and soldiers resting on their arms reversed in English towns and Welsh villages, hideous poilus and hamlets on the Belgian marshes, barbaric warriors in steel helmets shouting revenge to German citizens, frail crosses dreaming over village greens, and one tall one brooding over the graves of sailors on the Mull of O, a tank that threatens to crash into the back windows of the British Museum, Glasgow's cenotaph, and scraps of dirty paper blowing about in the marble pit in which it is set, the great white slab above the poor bones of America's unknown soldier, a sentry ever on guard over him, and a medal from the Rotary clubs among his decorations. A horrible engine of war exalted above the dead gunners at Hyde Park Corner, and not far from it the figure of David the Forerunner, symbolising the sacrifices of the machine gun corps. Somewhere there is a monument solemnly dedicated to the carrier pigeons of what they called the Great War, and I seem to have heard of one to the canaries we sappers used up in our mines. Endless futility. Memorials everywhere in every conceivable form and every degree of beauty and banality. And to what end? Is it, as the old man tells us, that their name liveth forevermore? Their name liveth forevermore. I know what the soldiers would have said to that. A word of 5 letters and 1 syllable. But what the soldiers said is not evidence nowadays, and one has to try to understand that. The Greenock War Memorial was dedicated in 1924. It has no inscribed list of names, too many apparently. Greenock had lost those young leaders of society from families who had made Greenock a place of artistic and industrial success. Shipbuilding, the main employer of the area, would continue under the false dawn of rearmament, but would always suffer from a shortage of workers and investment, leading to its ultimate demise under nationalisation. Greenock would never return to its 19th century glory and ambitions. George Blake represents the true disillusionment of those who returned. They had no time for the way the town was before, and certainly little time for what the Watt institution might believe or stand for. Greenock had changed. It certainly wasn't business as usual. The story, however, doesn't end there. I will now talk about an employee of the Watt. He had worked there for some time, done everything that was required of him, but he had a different set of morals and beliefs from those who ran the institute. In 1914, William Bogue was working in the Maclean Museum as an assistant curator. He was a cabinet maker to trade. He said, "The Territorial Army were all mobilised, and many were the questionings and wonderings as to why they had been selected. It had gone on so long, year in, year out, so many drills, so much money, so many holidays at camp, why it had become a part of their life, and why it had, and no one seemed to think why. But the thunderbolt came, and there was a great thud, with the result that many a young man was swept completely off his feet. Of course it was all voluntary, but then it was the awkward position into which one was put. Undoubtedly, the country claim was the most important, and everyone was anxious to do something for his or her country. But the trouble was that we could only do one thing for our country, and that was join up." At the end of 1915, every able man had to sign up for service in order to fill the ranks of the fallen. In April, William applied to the museum committee, asking that should he be called up, that his job be kept open for him when he returned. This was agreed. He recalls, "In the meantime we had to leave our employment, as it was unlawful for an employer to engage anyone that was wanted by the military. So the police were the next to give us a call on the 20th of June to ascertain our reasons for not reporting, and at 5:30 the following morning 2 kindly policemen called to arrest us. They were good enough to let us walk down in front of them, and we were put in a room with a big roasting fire, while to our surprise the other members of the group had been arrested earlier in the morning and were awaiting our arrival. In the forenoon we were brought before the police, with Sir Hugh Shaw Stewart presiding." Mr. John Cameron conducted the prosecution. 7 conscientious objectors in all appeared and pleaded not guilty. William had been attending meetings of the Society of Friends, the Quakers, along with his brother Robert and several other Greenock men. They all refused to join up, declaring all war to be inconsistent with the teaching of Christ and being fully convinced of the sacredness of human life, and also bearing in mind the divine command, "Thou shalt not kill." I must therefore refuse to take part in that which means the inflicting of death and consequent engendering of hatred and bitterness between nations. In regard to non-combatant duties, I would also claim exemption from undertaking same, under a military oath which necessitates obedience to all orders, and makes one part of the military machine. Such action on my part tending to make the work of killing more efficient. In putting forward these, my main reasons, I do so under the firm belief that in no other way can the principles of universal brotherhood be attained. On the 29th of February 1916 and on the 17th of March, we were to appear before the local tribunal at 3:20 p.m. in the Council Hall municipal buildings. The tribunal consisted of Bailey Carmichael, Baxter, Lemon, McCallum, Orr, and Colonel Lamont as military representative. The latter was said to have been a colonel in the old volunteers. We feel his experiences were confined to a time of no more war in the camps at the pleasure resorts, just like quite a number who understood soldiering as a back straightener. He was also a very prominent speaker in the Working Boys and Girls Religious Society. But he was pretty harsh and, like Shylock, claimed his pound of flesh. After several appeals, the men were sent to Hamilton Barracks. Here they were given uniforms, which they put on under protest. Refusing to obey orders, they were then court-martialed, where they were sentenced to 6 months hard labour at Berlini prison. They were then offered punitive work in the Home Office scheme for the employment of conscientious objectors if they passed the test of their objections. The Greenock Eight, namely the Bogue brothers, William Brown, William Johnson, David Miller, William Booth Ogilvie, William James Spears and Barclay Stevenson, were among those who passed the test, being placed in classified Group A, as men who should undoubtedly be treated as having a conscientious objection to all military service. Thereafter they were sent to a work camp in Wigtown and finally to Wakefield Prison and other work camps in England. We were a sight for many curious-minded people, but we arrived all right at Wigtown and found very comfortable apartments were waiting for us and many generous-hearted people. Our work here was felling trees, the wood of which was to be used as pit props. Life in the work camps was austere, but the men made the most of it. They organised football matches, put on plays and held concert parties. William continued to take part in the campaign for the rights of conscientious objectors. Many of the absolutist objectors, those who refused to do anything related to contribute to the war effort, suffered terribly, being exposed to all sorts of ill treatment, as well as in some cases being sentenced to death. The local newspapers were full of letters and comment on the slackers. Despite what people may think about their stance, it must have taken great bravery and mental fortitude to stick to their principles. The men spent the war in various camps throughout the UK until the war ended. The Maclean Museum Committee met not long after William's arrest and decided that they were no longer obliged to keep the job open. In the years following the war, William Bogue applied for a job at the museum on 2 separate occasions. He was unsuccessful. Letters to the Telegraph in 1916. Conscientious objectors have by their own outrageous statements brought their troubles upon themselves. What sort of conscience is it that would not permit a man to succour the suffering, protect the weak and comfort the dying? These men condemn themselves out of their own mouths and forfeit every claim to respect and sympathy. Not content with refusing to help their country in her direst hour of need, some of these conscientious objectors have been slandering our brave British soldiers who are shedding their blood for our protection. For many weary months our bravest and best have been enduring untold hardships for the ideals of honour, chivalry and liberty. They have cheerfully faced injury, disease and death, and many have found a grave on the battlefield. And now some grittless, backbone-less individuals with a cotton wool faculty they called a conscience come forward to brand them criminals. Sir, would it not be a good thing if the tribunals dealing with the conscientious ones, et hoc genus omne, were given power to deport them? If we are not willing to work, it follows that we have no right to eat, and the logical conclusion with regard to shirkers of whatever brand is that he should not be allowed to live and loaf in a country for which he is unwilling to fight. It is not fair that a great many of us should have sacrificed our boys, that these louts should walk around in comfort. Munition work cloaks far too many young fellows in the yards, as one with only half an eye can see. There should be a lot of clearing out, among the quill drivers especially, as with a very short training girls could not possibly make a worse show than some of them. Thank you for watching. I hope you have enjoyed the talk. Not everything is as we see it. The story behind the Greenock War Memorial is perhaps a shocking one to many, but it is so little known. We just assume that it was such an obvious thing to do and place to put it, that any other fact seems improbable. Hopefully I have introduced a few people to the work of George Blake, a wonderful local author, who is maybe saying the things out loud that many feel inside. His worldview was intensely cynical, but I believe entirely justifiable, considering what he and his schoolmates and battalion went through. What he wrote in Returned Empty would have been seen by so many as a work of fiction, but upon closer inspection it was based entirely on fact. I am also happy to have introduced you to William Bogue, thanks to his niece Jennifer. His story is one of true commitment to his values and manages to link the Watt Institute and its history into this one amazing story.